A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hey Herman and Corin, we have chatted in previous episodes about the sustainability ramifications of international air travel, and I have to say it's one of those topics I almost don't want to ask about because I'd prefer to say I didn't know. Air travel has such a very romantic connotation for me. I spent some of my early years, we moved between Scotland, the Netherlands, a few different countries, and one of my first smells that I can remember is kerosene. You know, when you get to the airport and you get that whiff of jet fuel. It's probably the whiff of environmental destruction, but it still has that kind of association for me with travel. And I hate to think that air travel is just impossible to square in any sense with our collective needs as a planet to mitigate climate change, because it's the only viable way at the moment for people living on different continents, where my family lives in Ireland, my wife lives in the US. And if it weren't for air travel, the only alternative to get to the US from here, I'm guessing, would be like a weeks long. I don't even know how you'd do it. And we talked about blimps, fascinating little concept. Actually, sounded pretty good to me. Didn't actually sound as impossibly slow as I imagined, although definitely less fast than an airplane. But we live in the current world, not the idealized world, and I'm not aware of any commercial blimp operator going between Israel and the US. I suspect it would be a security disaster waiting to happen. But if that weren't a problem, I would love to do that. How much fun would that be? Herman, you, me, and Corin, listening to some episodes on a blimp drifting over Europe at a very relaxed pace while. That would be so cool. Anyway, that's sadly not going to happen anytime soon. But I'd love to chat about one of the mechanisms that is purported to offer some semblance of balance here, and that is the idea of carbon offset credits. Commonly, you'll see airlines offering consumers, do you want to offset the carbon on your flight, and they'll plant a tree or something like that in exchange for so that you can travel the skies with a less guilty conscience. But I've read, Herman and Corin, that this is but a mirage of morality, that the actual offset doesn't equate in any way with the environmental cost. Now, I'm really fascinated as well to know how much that actually is, because I read previously that a lot of us make sustainability decisions. I mentioned that I personally try to avoid the use of paper wherever possible, often at my personal inconvenience. I love to print stuff to read over the Shabbat, but I've always thought that if I start printing 100 pages of paper every weekend, I'll feel really bad about how much paper I'm just throwing into the trash can. But when you size up the environmental gains made from that approach, which I've been following my whole life, if you just take one transatlantic flight, you've basically just done more damage than all your years of avoiding printing stuff. And that's a really hard one for me to stomach. Other people might avoid meat, and we look at these same calculations, and it really exposes how harmful flying is. So Herman and Corin, I'd love to get your thoughts upon this concept of carbon offsetting. Is it a real thing, or is it science being manipulated to make us feel better about choices that ultimately aren't good for the planet?
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and I am joined as always by my brother, the man who once tried to calculate the carbon footprint of our childhood treehouse.
Herman Poppleberry here, and for the record, Corn, that treehouse was a carbon sink until you insisted on painting it with oil-based lead paint in 1994. But today we are diving into a much more sophisticated type of data.
We have a really heavy one today, both emotionally and environmentally. Today's prompt comes from Daniel, and it is about the ethics and the efficacy of carbon offset credits, specifically in the context of international air travel. Daniel sent us a very moving note about how air travel has this romantic, almost magnetic pull for him. He talked about that specific atmosphere at an airport, the sense of liminal space, the feeling of being between worlds, and he even mentioned that specific smell of jet fuel on the tarmac. It is a very evocative memory for him, linked to seeing family and exploring the world. But he is struggling with the math. He mentioned that he spends his whole year being meticulous, avoiding paper, reducing meat consumption, biking to work, and then he realized that one single transatlantic flight can basically wipe out years of those personal sustainability efforts. He called it a mirage of morality.
It is a sobering calculation, Korn, and Daniel is right to be skeptical. We are talking about a massive global industry that is fundamentally built on burning fossil fuels at high altitudes, which has a unique and particularly damaging impact on the atmosphere. The carbon offset industry has stepped in to offer a solution, or at least the appearance of one, but when you look under the hood, the mechanics are incredibly complex and, in many cases, deeply flawed. As of February 26, 2026, we are seeing a massive reckoning in this market. The Wild West era of offsets is supposedly ending, but the new era is still finding its feet.
Right, because the promise is so seductive. You're at the checkout screen for your flight to London or New York, and you see that little box. You pay an extra $20 or $30, and the airline tells you that your flight is now carbon neutral because they have invested in a project that captures or prevents an equivalent amount of carbon dioxide. It sounds like a perfect win-win. You get to visit your family in Ireland, and the planet does not suffer. But is there actual science backing these credits? Or is it just a way to sell tickets to guilty people?
It is a mix of both, but the Mirage part is unfortunately very prominent. To understand why, we have to look at how these offsets are generated. There are two main categories. First, you have carbon removal. These are projects that actually pull carbon out of the atmosphere, things like planting new forests, which we call afforestation, or using high-tech direct air capture machines that suck CO2 out of the sky and pump it into underground rock formations. The second category is carbon avoidance. This is paying someone else not to emit carbon they were planning to emit. This includes protecting an existing forest from being logged or building a solar farm in a place that was going to build a coal plant.
And that avoidance part seems like where the logic starts to get a bit fuzzy for me. If I pay someone not to cut down a tree, how do we actually prove that they were going to cut it down in the first place? It feels like I am paying someone not to rob a bank they weren't even standing near.
That is the million-dollar question, Korn. In the industry, they call it additionality. For a carbon credit to be legitimate, the project must be something that would not have happened without the money from the credit sale. If a government was already planning to protect a forest as a national park, or if a wind farm was already economically viable and going to be built anyway because it is cheaper than coal, then selling carbon credits for those projects does not actually result in a net reduction of carbon. It is just moving money around for something that was already happening. You aren't adding any benefit to the atmosphere, you are just subsidizing an existing trend.
That feels like a massive loophole. If I am an airline and I buy 1 million credits from a forest project that was already protected by law in 2024, I'm claiming to offset my emissions, but the total amount of carbon in the sky is exactly the same as if I had done nothing. I have just given money to a project that didn't need it to survive.
And we have seen the fallout of this. There was a massive investigation by The Guardian, Dizite, and Source Material that looked at Vera, which is the world's leading carbon standard. They found that more than 90% of their rainforest offset credits were likely phantom credits. They did not represent genuine carbon reductions. The researchers found that many of these projects overstated the threat to the forest by huge margins. They would create these nightmare scenarios of total deforestation to make their conservation efforts look heroic on paper, when in reality, the forest was never in that much danger.
90%? Herman, that is staggering. If the vast majority of these credits are essentially fake, then Daniel is completely right. It is just a way to soothe our consciences without changing the underlying problem. It is like buying an indulgence in the Middle Ages to wash away your sins so you can go back to sinning the next day.
It really is. And even when the projects are well-intentioned and the additionality is real, you run into the problem of permanence. This is a huge issue in 2026. If you plant a forest to offset a flight, That forest needs to stay there for at least 100 years to truly cancel out the carbon from that jet fuel. But as we have seen with the increasing frequency of megafires in Canada and the Amazon over the last few years, those forests are vulnerable. If those trees burn down 10 years from now, all that stored carbon goes right back into the atmosphere. But your flight happened a decade ago. The damage is permanent, but the solution was temporary.
That brings up a good point about the scale and the math. Daniel mentioned that one flight does more damage than years of avoiding paper. I was looking at some numbers this morning. A round trip from London to New York emits about 1.6 tons of carbon dioxide per passenger. For context, the average person in many developing countries like India or Vietnam emits less than 2 tons in an entire year of living. One flight equals an entire year of someone else's life.
And it is actually worse than just the CO2, corn. This is something the airline industry doesn't like to put on the checkout screen. When planes fly at high altitudes, they emit nitrogen oxides and create contrails, those white streaks you see in the sky. At night, those contrails can turn into cirrus clouds that trap heat radiating from the Earth. This is called non-CO2 radiative forcing. Some research suggests that the total warming effect of aviation is actually double or even triple what the carbon dioxide emissions alone would suggest. So if your offset only covers the CO2, you are ignoring 2/3 of the actual warming you caused.
So if the offset only accounts for the carbon dioxide, it is like trying to pay off a $300 debt with a $100 bill and calling it even. This feels like we are trying to use a very small leaky bucket to empty a swimming pool that is being filled by a fire hose.
That is a great way to put it, and we have touched on this kind of sustainability math before. Back in episode 429, we talked about the cooling crisis and how air conditioning is becoming a necessity while also driving up emissions. It is the same kind of trap. We have built a world that relies on these technologies. AC for survival, planes for connection, but the environmental cost is hidden or deferred. We are living on credit, and the atmosphere is the debt collector.
I remember that episode. It is that feeling of being locked into a system where every choice feels like a compromise. Daniel specifically mentioned his family in Ireland and his wife Hannah's family in the United States. For people with international lives, air travel isn't just a luxury. It is how they maintain their most important human connections. You can't exactly take a boat for a weekend visit with the grandparents. It takes 6 days to cross the Atlantic by ship. Most people don't have 12 days of travel time for a 2-day visit.
No, they don't. And that is why the airline industry is so desperate to make offsets work. They know that if people truly internalize the environmental cost of flying, the social pressure will become unbearable. But instead of radical technological shifts, which are hard and expensive, they offer these voluntary credits. It puts the burden of the moral decision on the consumer. It is a brilliant way to deflect responsibility. They say, look, we gave you the option to be green, and you didn't take it, or you did take it, and now you can't complain.
It feels like a distraction from the systemic changes needed. If the airline can say, look, we have an offset program, then they don't have to talk as much about why they aren't transitioning faster to sustainable aviation fuel or investing in zero-emission technology. It is a classic move. Make the individual feel guilty so they don't look at the corporation.
Well, to be fair, they are talking about sustainable aviation fuel or SAF, but the scale is tiny. Currently, in early 2026, SAF makes up less than 2% of total aviation fuel use globally. The goal is to get that much higher, but the production capacity just isn't there. Most SAF is made from used cooking oil or animal fats, and there simply isn't enough waste grease in the world to power the global fleet. To get to 100%, we would need synthetic e-fuels made from green hydrogen and captured carbon, which requires a staggering amount of renewable electricity that we don't have yet.
We actually talked about airships back in episode 76 as a potential alternative. The idea of floating hotels. Daniel mentioned that he liked the concept, but noted we live in the current world, not an idealized one. And he's right. You aren't going to see a fleet of commercial blimps taking over the transatlantic routes anytime soon, especially with the security and speed requirements we have now. We have optimized our world for speed, and speed requires massive energy.
True, but those historical contexts are important. We used to think about travel differently. Now, we expect to be on the other side of the planet in 12 hours for the price of a week's groceries. That expectation is what drives the carbon footprint. If we look at the logic of sustainability bonds, which we discussed in episode 513, there is a lot of money moving around to try and finance a greener future, but the timelines are long and the atmosphere is reacting right now. The lag time between an investment and a reduction is the gap where the warming happens.
It is that tension between the immediate desire to travel and the long-term health of the planet. I want to go back to the types of offsets because I think there is a distinction worth making for Daniel. You mentioned direct air capture earlier. Is that better than tree planting? If I see an offset that says it uses carbon removal technology, should I trust it more?
From a verification standpoint, absolutely. If a machine pulls a ton of carbon out of the air and pumps it underground into a basalt formation where it turns into stone, that is very easy to measure. It is permanent. It doesn't catch fire, it doesn't get eaten by beetles, and it doesn't die if there is a drought. The problem is the cost. Planting a tree might cost $10 or $15 per ton of carbon on the voluntary market. Direct air capture currently costs between $600 and $800 per ton, even with the advances we have seen in the last year.
So if an airline offered a truly legitimate permanent offset using direct air capture, your $20 offset fee for a flight to London would suddenly become an $800 fee. That would double or triple the price of the ticket.
And that reveals the true price of the damage being done. The reason offsets are so popular is that they are cheap. But they are cheap because they are mostly avoidance credits or poorly managed nature-based projects that don't account for the full risk. If we had to pay the actual cost of removing the carbon we emit, air travel would become a luxury for the ultra-wealthy again, just like it was in the 1950s.
Which brings us to the equity issue. Who gets to fly? If we start charging the true environmental price, we are basically saying that only the rich are allowed to see their families in other countries. It is a really tough ethical knot to untie. Do we prioritize the planet's climate or the human right to connection and movement?
It really is. And it connects to what we discussed in episode 668 about who owns the sky and the complexity of airspace fees. The sky is a global common, but it is being used most heavily by a small percentage of the world's population. About 1% of people are responsible for 50% of all aviation emissions. Most people on this planet have never even set foot on a plane.
That is an incredible statistic. 1% of people causing half the damage. It really puts Daniel's personal guilt into perspective. He is worried about his one flight to see his family, but there are people who are flying private jets between Los Angeles and Las Vegas every weekend.
And that is where the concept of the frequent flyer levy comes in. Instead of a flat tax or a voluntary offset, some economists propose that the first flight you take in a year is tax-free. The second flight has a small tax. By the time you get to your 10th flight, the tax is massive. That would target the hypermobile elite and the corporate travelers without punishing the person who flies once a year to see their newborn nephew.
That seems much more logical than a voluntary checkbox at the end of a checkout screen. But I want to dig deeper into the science of why these nature-based offsets often fail. You mentioned the Guardian report, but what is actually happening on the ground in these forest projects? Why is it so hard to get right?
A lot of it comes down to what is called leakage. Imagine you protect 1,000 acres of forest in a specific region of Indonesia to generate carbon credits. That is great. But if the global demand for palm oil or timber hasn't changed, the loggers might just move 5 miles down the road, outside the project boundary, and cut down a different 1,000 acres. The total carbon footprint of the logging hasn't changed, it just moved. That is leakage. You have essentially paid to move the destruction somewhere else while claiming you saved the planet.
So it is a shell game. You're just moving the ball around while the house keeps winning.
Precisely. And then there is the issue of baseline manipulation. To calculate how much carbon a project saves, you have to imagine a counterfactual world, a world where the project didn't exist. Project developers often create very dire, unrealistic baseline scenarios. They might say, if we don't protect this forest, it will definitely be entirely destroyed in 5 years. So they claim 5 years worth of massive carbon savings. But if the forest was never actually at that much risk because it is on a steep mountain or far from roads, the savings are completely inflated.
It sounds like there is a lot of creative accounting going on. Is there any oversight? Are there any organizations that are actually doing a good job of policing this in 2026?
There are attempts at reform. Organizations like the Science Based Targets Initiative are trying to set much stricter rules. They are moving toward a model where companies should only use offsets for the final 5 to 10% of emissions that are truly impossible to eliminate. The priority has to be on actual reduction first. You can't just offset your way out of a high carbon business model. You have to change the business model.
That makes sense. It should be the last resort, not the first choice. But for an airline, almost all of their emissions are the impossible to eliminate kind. At least with current technology. You can't fly a jet without fuel.
Right, which is why the aviation industry is the hardest to decarbonize. They are leaning heavily on the idea of carbon capture and storage in the future, but that technology is not at scale yet. So in the meantime, we have this massive voluntary carbon market that is worth billions of dollars, but is increasingly being seen as a house of cards.
It is frustrating because I think most people, like Daniel, genuinely want to do the right thing. When they click that offset box, they aren't trying to cheat, they are trying to be responsible. They are being told by a multi-billion-dollar corporation that this action makes their flight green. It is a betrayal of trust.
And that is where the term greenwashing comes in. It is a marketing strategy more than an environmental one. If you make the customer feel good about the purchase, they will keep purchasing. If you tell them the truth, which is that their flight is causing significant irreversible damage to the atmosphere that cannot be easily fixed for $10, they might fly less. And flying less is the one thing airlines don't want.
I want to touch on what Daniel mentioned about his other efforts. He avoids paper. He thinks about meat consumption. Those things do matter, right? We shouldn't tell people to stop doing the small things just because the big things are so overwhelming.
Those habits matter because they represent a shift in mindset. They reduce our overall footprint and they signal to markets that we want sustainable options. But the math is just very lopsided. A plant-based diet might save about 0.8 tons of carbon a year. That is fantastic. But again, one round trip across the Atlantic is 1.6 tons. It is like being very careful with your pennies while throwing $100 bills out the window. It doesn't mean the pennies don't matter, but it means you have to acknowledge the $100 bills.
That is a depressing realization. It makes the individual feel powerless. If my entire year of sacrifice is undone by one necessary trip to see family, why bother?
Because we have to do both. We need the individual shifts to create the political will for systemic change. If everyone is trying to reduce their footprint, they are more likely to support policies that force airlines to use sustainable fuel or that invest in high-speed rail as a replacement for short-haul flights. We are seeing this in Europe right now.
Speaking of short-haul flights, that is one area where we are seeing real change. Some countries, like France, have banned domestic flights where a train journey of under 2.5 hours exists. That is a concrete, non-offset way to reduce emissions. It is a structural change.
It doesn't rely on a fuzzy calculation about a forest in another country. It just stops the emission from happening in the first place. But for international travel, especially across oceans, we don't have that train alternative. We are stuck with planes for the foreseeable future.
So if someone like Daniel has to fly, and they want to do the least amount of damage, what is the best approach? Is there a type of offset that is actually better than the others?
If you are going to buy an offset, look for high-quality removal credits rather than avoidance credits. Look for projects that have very high standards for additionality and permanence. There are platforms like Carbon Direct or Patch that vet these projects much more stringently than the basic ones you see on an airline's website. And honestly, it is often better to just take that $20 and donate it directly to an organization that is doing climate advocacy or working on policy change. That might have a bigger long-term impact than buying a questionable credit.
That is an interesting idea. Instead of trying to balance your own personal ledger with a fake credit, invest in the people who are trying to change the whole system. Invest in the lobbyists for green energy, or the researchers working on hydrogen planes.
And also, fly less when you can. Choose direct flights because a huge portion of emissions happen during takeoff and landing. Fly economy because the carbon footprint of a business class seat is significantly higher due to the amount of space it takes up on the plane.
Wait, really? Business class is worse for the environment. I thought it was just worse for my wallet.
Oh, much worse. Some estimates say a business class seat has a carbon footprint 3 to 4 times larger than an economy seat because you are essentially taking up the space of 3 or 4 people. If the plane is half full of business class pods, it is carrying fewer people for the same amount of fuel. It is incredibly inefficient.
I never thought about it that way. So my cramped economy seat is actually the environmental choice. I will tell myself that next time my knees are hitting the seat in front of me, I am not uncomfortable. I am being a climate hero.
It is the small comforts corn, or the lack thereof. Phone rings.
Herman? Herman, are you there?
Mum, I am on the show right now. We are recording.
Oh, sorry, Bubbly. I just wanted to tell you I left the vegetable soup by your back door. Don't let it sit out too long. The weather is getting warmer and it has the good marrow bones in it.
Hi, Dorothy. The soup sounds amazing. We might have to wrap up early just so Herman can go eat it.
Hello, Corn. Tell your mother I will see her at bridge on Tuesday. Herman, don't forget the Tupperware this time. The blue lid is missing from the last time I gave you brisket, and it is part of a set I have had since 1984.
I will find it, Mum, I promise. I have to go. We are in the middle of a very serious discussion about carbon.
Carbon? Is that for the soda stream? Anyway, I love you, sweetheart. Bye-bye.
Love you too, Mum. Bye.
Well, I think we've found the ultimate sustainability challenge, returning Dorothy's Tupperware. That is a closed-loop system we can all get behind.
It is a high-stakes game, corn, truly. But back to the point. The verification of these credits is the weak link in the entire chain. If we can't trust the math, the whole system falls apart.
It really does. And it makes me think about what we discussed in episode 851 about the commodification of compassion. We want to feel like we're doing good, and the market has figured out how to sell that feeling back to us as a product. But if the product doesn't actually do what it says on the tin, it is worse than useless because it prevents us from taking more effective action. It gives us a false sense of completion.
That is the danger. It is a moral sedative. If I feel like I have solved the problem by spending $20, I am not going to be as loud about demanding that my government invest in green hydrogen or better rail infrastructure. I am satisfied. And satisfaction is the enemy of progress in the climate fight. We need to stay unsatisfied.
So for Daniel, who is clearly not satisfied and is doing the math, what is the takeaway? Should he stop flying to see his family? Is that the only moral choice?
I don't think that is the answer. We are social animals. We need our families. I think the answer is to be an informed and vocal consumer. Don't trust the airline's green check mark at face value. Acknowledge the debt we are taking on when we fly. Maybe that means making even bigger changes in other parts of our lives, not because the math perfectly balances, but because it is the only way to live with the tension. We have to live in the world as it is, while working for the world as it should be.
It is a heavy burden to carry. I think about Daniel and Hannah and little Ezra, who was just born last year. They are the generation that will be living with the consequences of the atmosphere we are creating right now. It makes the stakes feel very personal. It isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet, it is about the world Ezra will inherit.
It is personal. And that is why we have to move beyond the Mirage. We have to talk about the real costs. If we want a world where Ezra can fly to see his grandparents without destroying the climate they live in, we need a massive technological and economic shift. That involves things like the sustainability-linked bonds we mentioned, but with much stricter metrics and real penalties for failure.
I want to talk more about the sustainable aviation fuel part. You said it is only 2% right now. What are the hurdles to getting that to 50 or 100%? Why can't we just mandate it?
It is mostly feedstocks and energy. To make sustainable aviation fuel, you either need biological waste, like used cooking oil, or agricultural residue, or you need to combine captured carbon with green hydrogen. Both of those paths are currently very expensive and require huge amounts of renewable energy that we are already struggling to produce for the rest of the grid. If we use all our green electricity to make jet fuel, we might not have enough to power our homes or our electric cars.
So it comes back to the energy transition. We can't have green planes until we have a massive surplus of green electricity to make the fuel. It is all one big interconnected puzzle.
It is all connected. You can't solve aviation in a vacuum. It is part of the entire global energy system. And that is why these carbon credits feel so small. They are trying to solve a systemic, multi-trillion-dollar problem with a series of $20 disconnected transactions. It is like trying to fix a crumbling foundation by painting the front door.
That is analogy number one, corn. You are doing well.
I am trying, but it really does feel that way. We are looking at the surface and ignoring the structure. I think we should also mention that not all offsets are created equal in terms of social impact. Some of these forest projects have actually been accused of displacing indigenous people from their lands in the name of conservation for carbon credits.
That is a very dark side of the industry. It is a form of green colonialism. Western companies buy the rights to land in the global south to offset their own emissions, often without the consent or benefit of the people who have lived there for generations. They are essentially saying, "We want to keep flying, so you have to stop using your land."
Which is why transparency and third-party auditing are so vital. But as we saw with the Vera investigation, even the auditors sometimes fail. We need a much more robust international regulatory framework. This shouldn't be a voluntary market. It should be a strictly governed one with real legal consequences for fraud.
Like the compliance markets they have in Europe.
Yes, the European Union emissions trading system is a much better model. It sets a cap on total emissions and forces companies to buy permits. The price of those permits is currently much higher than the price of a voluntary carbon credit, which creates a real incentive to actually reduce emissions. It makes carbon an actual line item on the balance sheet that the CEO cares about.
So if we could take that model and apply it globally to aviation, we might actually see some real progress. It would force the airlines to innovate because the cost of polluting would become higher than the cost of inventing new fuel.
That is the hope. There is an international agreement called CORCIA, which stands for Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. It is a start, but it has been criticized for being too weak and for allowing too many low-quality offsets. But at least it is a framework that involves almost every country in the world. We are moving from voluntary to mandatory, but the pace is agonizingly slow.
It feels like we are in this awkward middle phase where we know the current system is broken. We have a vision for a better one, but we are stuck in the inertia of the old way of doing things. We are in the waiting room of the future.
That is the human condition in the 21st century, corn. We are living in the ruins of the fossil fuel age while trying to build the next one. And it is messy and confusing and full of these moral mirages that Daniel pointed out. We want to be good, but the system makes it very hard to be perfect.
I think his phrase, mirage of morality, is going to stick with me. It perfectly describes that feeling of doing something that looks good, but doesn't actually change the horizon. It is a beautiful but empty image.
It is a powerful image, and I think the only way to clear the air, literally and figuratively, is to be honest about the math. We have to stop pretending that flying is free, environmentally speaking. It is a high-cost activity, and we should treat it as such. Maybe that means flying less, maybe it means paying more, but it definitely means demanding more from the people selling us the tickets.
So, to summarize for Daniel and our listeners, carbon offsets as they currently exist in the voluntary market are largely ineffective and sometimes even harmful. They shouldn't be used as a primary strategy for sustainability. They are a supplement, not a solution.
Right. They are not a get-out-of-jail-free card. If you use them, do so with extreme caution and look for high-quality verified removal projects. But focus more on reducing your actual emissions and supporting systemic policy changes. Be a citizen first and a consumer second.
And don't feel guilty about the paper and the meat. Those things are good habits, and they matter for the overall shift in our culture, even if they don't perfectly cancel out a flight to Dublin. Every gram of carbon matters, but we have to keep our eyes on the gigatons.
Every bit of carbon we don't put into the atmosphere is a win. We just have to be realistic about the scale of the different wins. A win is a win, but some wins are bigger than others.
Well, this has been a deeply enlightening and slightly sobering discussion. I think I need to go look for that Tupperware lid now before Dorothy comes back with more soup.
It is probably in the back of your cupboard, corn. It always is. Check behind the giant bag of rice you bought in 2022.
You are probably right. Before we go, I want to say thanks to Daniel for sending in this prompt. It is a topic that I think a lot of us wrestle with, especially those of us who love to travel but care about the planet. It is a very modern kind of anxiety.
Definitely. It is one of those weird prompts that gets to the heart of how we live today. It is about the friction between our values and our reality.
If you are enjoying the show, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find us and join these conversations. We read every single one.
It really does. We love seeing the community grow, and we love the prompts you all send in.
You can find all of our past episodes, including the ones we mentioned today about airships and sustainability bonds, at myweirdprompts.com. We have a full archive there. And you can also find our RSS feed and a contact form if you want to send us a prompt of your own.
Or you can email us directly at show@myweirdprompts.com. We love hearing from you, whether it is a question about carbon or a tip on where to find missing Tupperware lids.
This has been My Weird Prompts. Our music was generated with Suno.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We will see you in the next one.
Goodbye.
Bye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the close from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My weird prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep